It began as a lesson, a husband's right to correct a wife who spoke too loudly. But Rome never stopped at correction, it perfected it. From a single household punishment came a machine, curved wood, leather straps, silence engineered into shape. They said it restored order. Soon, senators were watching. Then, the crowds. A tool built to humble one woman became Rome's newest form of entertainment. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Rome, 89 years before Christ. Beneath the marble ceilings of a senator's villa, discipline was being redesigned. Her name was Julia Vtoria, a young noblewoman whose only crime was defiance. Earlier that day, her husband had offered her a cup of bitter tonic, commanding her to drink it in the name of purification. She had asked what it was. He had said it was to cleanse her womb. She had refused. In that pause, that single word, no, centuries of Roman hierarchy trembled. By sundown, 4 slaves entered her chamber. Their eyes stayed low as they stripped her of her stola and led her barefoot across the courtyard. The air smelled of oil and burning resin. At the center of the workshop stood a new contraption, smooth, polished, deceptively gentle. Its frame resembled a cradle, but this was no cradle for children. It was built for obedience. Her husband stood beside it, hands clasped behind his back, voice steady. "This," he said, "is to help you remember your place." Julia was bound, wrists behind her, knees locked into the curve, chest pressed against the wood. The straps tightened slowly, pressing her body into unnatural alignment. It was not the sharp pain of torture. It was worse, a controlled ache that deepened by the minute, a lesson written into her muscles. The senators called it discipline. The slaves called it the cradle. When she finally screamed, it wasn't from physical pain. It was from the realization that she had become a prototype. The carpenter was already sketching the design. Her suffering would be replicated, standardized, sold. In the days that followed, Julia was left on a low mat, fevered, her arms wrapped in linen. Outside her chamber, men discussed modifications, stronger hinges, iron reinforcement, a clasp for the neck to prevent movement. Each improvement turned cruelty into craftsmanship. They would tell themselves it was for virtue, that Rome needed order, that pain could purify. But what they really built was an economy, one where obedience was currency and women's silence was profit. Soon, whispers spread through noble houses. Other husbands wanted one. Other wives would learn the same lesson. And Julia, bruised and burning, would learn hers. That in Rome, pain was never private. It was always public, only waiting for a crowd. By the next morning, the carpenter had returned. He wasn't a torturer, just a craftsman following orders, the kind of man Rome valued most. He sketched Julia's restraint on parchment, testing the angles, measuring the depth of the curve. He didn't look at her face, only the bruises that marked where the leather had pressed too deeply. Every measurement was progress, every scar a note for improvement. Julia watched through a curtain. Her body trembled with fever, but her mind catalogued every word. Widen the arc, reinforce the base, tighten the neck brace. Her pain was now a blueprint. By dusk, the prototype had a name: Disciplinaria, the instrument of discipline. Her husband called it elegant. The senators who visited called it ingenious. They admired how it broke the body slowly without spilling a drop of blood. It teaches patience, one remarked. Even mercy. That was Rome's genius, to make cruelty sound moral. Soon, word spread beyond the villa walls. Other noblemen sent servants to commission their own versions, each customized for domestic order. Some smaller, for adolescent wives. Some reinforced, for repeat offenders. The workshop couldn't keep up. The carpenter's drawings were copied by apprentices and distributed discreetly among the wealthy. By the end of that year, the disciplinaria had become more than an object. It was a concept, a ritual of correction disguised as architecture. Rome's laws didn't need to command obedience anymore. They could outsource it to design. The philosophers rationalized it easily. The household, wrote one jurist, is the empire in miniature. To rule the home is to rule the state. If a man could not control his wife, how could he claim to control his subjects? The logic was perfect and fatal. The senators now debated which version of the device was most effective. They gathered over wine to exchange notes, not about governance, but about posture, breath, and endurance. The political became anatomical, and women, even the silent ones, began to understand. They were no longer judged for what they said, but for how long they could endure pain without breaking. In time, a new phrase entered private law: corruptio maritalis, the marital correction. It allowed husbands to enforce obedience through instruments of restraint deemed reasonable. Reasonable, a word that buried centuries of violence under philosophy. Julia heard that phrase whispered through corridors. She understood what it meant. Her suffering had been legalized. When she was finally permitted to walk again, her arms weak and trembling, she passed the carpenter in the hall. He bowed slightly, out of habit, not respect. She caught a glimpse of his ink-stained fingers, the scroll tucked under his arm. It bore her name, Vtoria Type Y. That was how history first recorded her, not as a person, but as a model. Weeks passed. In noble houses across Rome, the disciplinaria began to appear like furniture, tucked behind curtains, beside altars, next to mirrors. The whispers grew darker, that some men began using it not for correction, but for pleasure. Rome had discovered a new symmetry between punishment and desire. At private banquets, senators bragged of how long their wives lasted. They bet coins over which model produced tears faster or silence longer. Even those who found it obscene didn't speak, because silence too was Roman. Julia listened. She was alive, but erased. Every time she moved her shoulder, she remembered, not just the pain, but the applause it might earn somewhere else. Her agony had left her body and entered the culture. In her fever dreams, she imagined an empire made of echoes, women bound in every house, each screaming the same silent scream, each teaching Rome what it wanted to believe, that power could be gentle, that control could look like care. And when she awoke, she understood the truth, that Rome would spend centuries denying. The disciplinaria was never built to correct rebellion. It was built to create it, so that every act of defiance could feed the system that punished it. By perfecting obedience, Rome had invented the first machine of moral control, a device that made cruelty look rational and suffering feel deserved. It began, as most Roman innovations did, with a dinner, a senator's banquet, the kind where men measured power not by what they ate, but by what they could make others endure. The air inside the villa trembled with the perfume of olive oil and roasted meat. Golden lamps flickered against marble columns. The sound of laughter drifted like incense through the hall. At the center of it all stood a new object, polished, curved, gleaming like furniture. The disciplinaria had been remade, this time taller, with iron clasps and a carved step for kneeling. No one called it a torture device. They called it the demonstration piece. Julia stood behind a curtain. Her wrists still bore faint scars. Her husband's voice filled the room. "Gentlemen," he said, "what you are about to see is not punishment. It is preservation of virtue, of order, of Rome itself." A steward pulled the curtain aside. The lamps glared. Every man in the room turned. Julia was no longer a wife tonight. She was the lesson. Her stola was simple, the color of bone, her hair unbound. She walked barefoot toward the device, her steps quiet, deliberate. She was not dragged this time. That was part of the illusion, to make submission look like choice. As she approached the frame, the murmurs grew. "Remarkable design," one senator whispered. "Truly Roman, efficient, restrained." Another raised his cup. "To civilization," he said. The room laughed. Julia stopped in front of the disciplinaria. A slave girl knelt beside her and began loosening her belt. The cloth slid from her shoulders. The room inhaled. Julia did not flinch. She stepped forward, positioned herself, and waited. The straps tightened. Thighs, wrists, spine, neck. The wood creaked softly, a sound more intimate than screams. Her husband gestured to the crowd. "Observe," he said, "how the body aligns, how resistance dissolves into order." The senators nodded, pretending to study, but their eyes lingered longer than they should. Some were aroused, others repulsed, none indifferent. Pain, in Rome, was never just punishment. It was a performance of hierarchy, a demonstration that power could make the human body obey geometry. 2 hours, one senator wagered. She'll break before the second. Another shook his head. Not her. The first always lasts longer. Coins clinked on the table. Laughter rippled again. Julia's back burned. Her shoulders screamed, but she made no sound. The more they watched, the quieter she became, until silence itself turned into defiance. That silence unsettled them. Men who could command armies could not command her breath. Her husband smiled thinly. "Discipline is beauty," he said. "And beauty, gentlemen, is obedience refined." It was a sentence Rome would repeat for centuries. When the straps were finally released, Julia stood on her own, bloodless, expressionless, but not broken. Her hair clung to her face, her knees trembled, yet her eyes were sharper than the iron at her back. "Did they enjoy it?" she asked. Her husband blinked. "What?" "Your show." He said nothing. She smiled, small, deliberate. "Next time," she whispered, "let me choose the music." The men laughed, uneasy, forced, unsure whether they were mocking her or themselves. The dinner continued, but something in the air had shifted. The senators spoke louder, drank faster. For the first time, they had seen the thin line between dominance and dependence, how power needed pain to feel alive. In the weeks that followed, the story spread faster than any decree. Servants repeated it in markets, courtiers whispered it in bathhouses. A senator's wife had been displayed and had not broken. Some said it was erotic, others said it was blasphemy. Everyone agreed on one thing: they wanted to see it again. Thus began Rome's new fashion: discipline as entertainment. Private villas began hosting moral demonstrations. The same senators who wrote laws about virtue now sponsored nights of correction. Staged performances where women, slaves, or debtors were bound before audiences to illustrate the power of restraint. The justifications came easily. It deters rebellion. It preserves order. It's not violence, it's virtue. They began to treat obedience like theatre, rehearsed, ritualized, profitable. In one surviving letter from a Roman magistrate to his brother, he describes such an event. She was silent for an hour and 43 minutes. The crowd applauded her composure. I could not decide who was more disciplined, she or the men who watched without blinking. That was the point. Rome had found a new spectacle, one cleaner than bloodsport, more elegant than the arena. It was cruelty disguised as culture, control masked as moral philosophy. And Julia Vtoria, the woman who refused to bow, became its first performer. She had not chosen this role, but she understood its script better than they did. Because in every performance of power, there's always a moment, brief, dangerous, when the audience begins to see itself. That night, when the villa finally emptied and the torches dimmed, Julia walked past the empty frame. She touched the wood gently, her fingers tracing the grooves left by her own wrists. It was warm still, holding the echo of her pulse. She smiled, not in pride, but in realization. They believed the device had broken her. They were wrong. It had exposed them. It didn't take long for the walls to crack. What began as rumor soon became policy. In Rome, nothing spread faster than the illusion of morality, especially when it served the powerful. Within a year, the disciplinaria left the senator's villa. It was no longer a husband's toy or a craftsman's novelty. It had become a statement, an object of law, sanctioned and reproduced under the banner of virtue. The Senate called it instrumentum correctionis, a tool of correction. The courts called it moderate coercion. The people called it what it was, a show. The first public demonstration took place near the river markets, in a small amphitheatre once used for civic plays. A wooden platform was erected at dawn. Officials told the crowd that justice would be displayed, not spoken. They came in droves, merchants, soldiers, wives, beggars, drawn by curiosity, by gossip, by the promise of something half forbidden, half sacred. At the center of the stage stood the familiar frame, curved wood, polished iron, sunlight gleaming off its straps. The man overseeing it wore a magistrate's sash. His voice was calm, practiced. "Today," he announced, "Rome witnesses the purification of disobedience." The woman brought forward wasn't noble. She was a widow, accused of blasphemy, a vague, unprovable charge. Her real crime was public speech. She had mocked a tax collector in the forum. Now, bound before hundreds, her words were turned into performance. As the first strap tightened, the crowd gasped. Some turned away. Others leaned closer. The sound of leather against flesh carried like music. One man in the audience whispered, "It looks like prayer." Another replied, "Then why does she scream like a hymn?" That was the moment Rome changed, when punishment ceased to be hidden and became aesthetic. The line between justice and theatre blurred. Magistrates issued new decrees, citing the moral benefits of public correction. Philosophers wrote that the eye learns faster than the ear. Soon, small arenas across the empire adopted the spectacle. What had begun in private households became a civic performance, a ritual to remind citizens who truly ruled their bodies. In the archives of Ostia, a fragment of parchment survives. It lists the expenses for one such event: 2 attendants for restraint, 1 physician to keep subjects alive, 1 public crier, 3 musicians, linen for modesty. Linen for modesty, a footnote in cruelty. By then, the disciplinaria had been adapted for efficiency. Versions made of iron replaced wood. The curve was deepened to prolong endurance. Some had handles to tilt the frame toward the crowd. Rome had turned obedience into architecture, each refinement a moral justification. Even the language changed. Torture became demonstration. Suffering became education. Women were no longer punished. They were reformed. The propaganda worked. Poets began writing about the silence of the virtuous. Artists carved reliefs showing bound figures under divine light. The symbol of pain had been absorbed into Rome's vocabulary of piety. But Julia Vtoria, who had started it all, watched from the shadows. She sat among the spectators during one of these performances, veiled and silent. The woman on the stage was young, perhaps 16, her crime no greater than stealing bread. Julia's husband, now elevated to magistrate, sat beside her, sipping wine, explaining improvements to his peers. Stronger locks, adjustable angles, better restraint for small bodies. The crowd roared when the girl cried out. A few clapped. The musicians played softly to mask the rhythm of pain. Julia didn't move. Her hands were steady on her lap. But inside her, something began to fracture. Not from grief, but recognition. She understood now. She had become Rome's template. Her pain was not forgotten. It had been perfected, multiplied, institutionalized. Every scream now echoed her own. That night, she returned home and stared at the city's skyline. Marble, glowing beneath torchlight, temples shimmering like clean bones. Rome called itself the Empire of Reason. But Julia knew better. It was an empire of reflection, built to mirror cruelty until it looked divine. Because that was Rome's true invention. Not law, not order, but spectacle. The ability to make violence look holy. And as the empire's applause echoed through the night, Julia whispered the only truth that remained. They don't want silence. They want the sound of it breaking. By the second year, Rome no longer hid its appetite. What began as rumor had become an institution. Every act of correction now left a record: name, cause, duration, and result. The bureaucrats were meticulous. If a woman cried within the first hour, the session was considered successful. If she remained silent, the magistrate received commendation. Pain had entered the paperwork. The empire, in its obsession with order, could not resist turning cruelty into administration. The disciplinaria was no longer just an object of punishment. It had become a unit of measure, a quiet entry in the empire's ledgers. Rome's scribes began to classify disobedience as if it were a commodity: minor defiance, domestic insubordination, moral deviation. For each, there was a corresponding fine, a replacement value, a duration of restraint. They said it brought balance, but in truth, it brought profit. Every time a husband requested a public demonstration to correct his wife, a fee was paid to the local magistrate. A portion went to maintenance of the stage, another to the guards, another to the Senate. The silence of women had become taxable. In one surviving inscription from the province of Campania, a list appears carved into stone: 2 denarii for discipline within the home, 5 for correction witnessed by 10 or more citizens, 10 if performed with music or for moral instruction. The empire had found a way to monetize obedience. Julia Vtoria read those words years later, etched into the walls of a magistrate's courtyard. She stood before them as one might stand before a grave. Her name was not written there, but she could feel it between the lines. The cradle had grown beyond her, no longer hers, but Rome's, a ghost made of law and laughter. When she walked through the marketplace, she could see its reflection everywhere. Housewives lowered their voices when guards passed. Young girls were taught not how to read, but how to walk. Softly, eyes down, words measured like currency. Every silence was a deposit in the empire's bank of order. Rome called this virtue. The priests called it purity. The lawyers called it property. In the courts, husbands began presenting silence as evidence of loyalty. Wives who spoke out risked charges of moral disorder. The lex domus, the law of the household, now codified obedience. It stated that the child shall follow the father's command, and the wife shall follow the husband's silence. It was written in marble, taught in temples, and whispered in prayers. The gods, they said, had designed women to listen. To question was to offend both man and heaven. Rome's economy no longer depended on grain, gold, or slaves alone. It depended on complicity, the invisible labor of silence. Each obedient wife was a stabilizing figure, each quiet home a small empire of order feeding the greater one. The system worked because it looked righteous. Senators spoke of moral reform. They claimed that vice had been conquered, that rebellion had been tamed. But in the baths, in the dark corners of the palaces, their jokes betrayed them. They laughed about how long a woman could last on the frame, how her breath broke, how her eyes dimmed. Their laughter was not pleasure, it was proof. Proof that cruelty had been normalized enough to become comfort. Julia saw it all. She no longer screamed or trembled. The fever that once burned her now cooled into clarity. Rome didn't fear women like her for their voices. It feared them for their endurance, for what survived after the body had been bent, after the pain had become routine. She began to write, fragments, small notes on scraps of linen hidden under tiles sewn into the lining of her garments. They measure our silence, one fragment read. But silence is not absence, it is waiting. If Rome had an economy of silence, then Julia became its counterfeit. The cradle was now used in provincial courts, temples, even schools. Priests claimed that enduring the frame was a form of purification, that submission to pain cleansed sin. Women knelt in public squares, bound, weeping quietly, surrounded by spectators reciting prayers. The crowd called it piety, the state called it peace. And still, Julia watched. She saw the men in the front rows, their faces blank, their eyes trained not on the victims, but on the idea. The idea that suffering could be beauty, that the empire's stability was worth the cost of a woman's breath. Rome's brilliance was not in its laws, or its armies, or its marble. It was in its ability to convince the world that domination was divine. That obedience was evidence of civilization. Every time a woman bowed, the empire grew stronger. Every silence fed it. Every scream became a hymn. But the system had one flaw, the same one that haunted Julia every night. Pain is temporary. Witness is not. She had seen the device become an empire. She had seen obedience turned into spectacle, then into economy, then into faith. But she also knew something Rome could not calculate. Memory was not measurable. One whisper, one surviving fragment, one woman who refused to forget. That was enough to break the arithmetic of control. And as Julia folded her final scrap of linen and hid it under a stone in her garden, she smiled faintly. "They can tax silence," she wrote, "but they cannot own what it remembers." By the 7th year, her name had nearly disappeared from records. Julia Vtoria was officially dead, her estate transferred, her lineage erased. But in the back rooms of Rome's magistrates, her existence lingered like an error the empire could not delete. The cradle had become a ritual of order. It was now a feature of civic festivals, a moral performance endorsed by priests. Every spring, the forum hosted what was called the renewal of virtue. Women bound before the crowd as citizens cheered their silence. It was religion by repetition, obedience as choreography. And then, one morning, a messenger arrived at Julia's villa outside the city. He was young, nervous, his hands ink-stained from the scroll he carried. He bowed. "By order of the governor, the woman once called Vtoria is requested for a public appearance." "Requested," Julia repeated, tasting the word. "Not commanded." The messenger hesitated. "It is said, you will not be harmed. You are to be presented as an example of reform." Julia smiled faintly. "Ah, a survivor on display. They want proof that the machine works." The messenger did not meet her eyes. "You will be provided garments, attendants, and protection. The crowd expects to see the first woman who endured the cradle." "Then they shall." She agreed without pause. Not from pride, not from defiance, but from precision. She understood the empire's hunger too well to resist it. The only way to poison spectacle was from within it. The amphitheater was small, built for moral demonstrations, a circular stage lined with stone benches. The morning sun turned the iron frame at its center into a mirror. Around it, vendors sold figs and wine, as if cruelty were a festival. When Julia entered, the murmur rose into applause, not hatred, not sympathy, something worse, fascination. She was no longer a woman. She was myth made flesh, the rumor that had outlived her erasure. Her husband was long dead. The men waiting in the tribunal seats were strangers, younger, ambitious, eager to prove that discipline had no end. The governor stood, gesturing toward the cradle. "Behold," he said, "the mother of our virtue, the first who taught that obedience is strength." Julia walked to the center of the stage. Her dress was white, her wrists bare. For a moment, she looked at the device that had once broken her body and realized it was smaller than she remembered. Power always shrinks when you stand to face it. A guard approached, hesitant. "Do you require assistance?" "No," she said. "I remember how it works." The crowd laughed softly, uncertain if it was permitted. Julia ran her fingers along the curve of the frame. She could still feel where her ribs had pressed years before. She turned to the governor. "May I speak before we begin?" He frowned. "Speak. That was not part of the arrangement." "Then add it," she said. "It is only fair. The instrument and its creation deserve words." The governor exchanged glances with his aides. Perhaps he thought a small concession would flatter him. "Very well," he said. "You may speak briefly." Julia stepped forward, her voice calm, precise. "They say this device teaches silence, that it turns defiance into discipline. But look around you. Listen, you cheer, not because I obeyed, but because I survived." The crowd shifted uneasily. "Rome," she continued, "is an empire afraid of echoes. You built a machine to erase women's voices, and yet, here I am, speaking with the body you tried to fold into shape." A priest rose angrily. "Enough! You were brought here to honor order, not to insult it." Julia smiled. "If your order is so strong, why does a single voice threaten it?" The amphitheater stilled. The governor motioned to the guards. "Proceed." But Julia stepped closer to the cradle, her voice rising, clear and deliberate. "You may tie me again if you wish. You can measure my breath, count my silence, praise my restraint, but remember this: it was my scream that built your peace, and it is my laughter that will break it." A wave of murmurs swept the stands. Some shouted, others fell quiet. The governor's hand trembled. He had expected submission, not spectacle. But now, the performance was his, not hers. He was the one being watched. Julia turned toward the crowd. "You want virtue?" she said. "Then learn this. Obedience cannot purify power. It only perfumes it." Then, before anyone could stop her, she threw her head back and laughed. It was not madness. It was clarity. A laugh bright and sharp as broken glass. It tore through the amphitheater, echoing against stone and marble. The sound startled the guards, silenced the musicians, scattered the pigeons from the roof. For a breathless instant, no one moved. And then the crowd began to laugh too, not in mockery, but confusion, liberation, contagion. The sound grew, multiplied, rolling through the theater like a storm. That was the moment Rome lost control of its own invention. The cradle had been built to convert rebellion into silence. But Julia had reversed it, turning silence back into rebellion. When the guards finally approached, They found her standing tall, tears in her eyes, still smiling. She whispered, "You wanted obedience. You built worship. But you forgot that worship too needs a god, and gods are never quiet." No one dared touch her. The crowd's noise had turned dangerous. Not a riot, but something worse. Thought. As the sun slipped lower, Julia walked out of the amphitheater without escort. No decree followed, no arrest. The officials were frozen between fear and admiration. That night, graffiti appeared on walls across the city. A woman's face drawn in charcoal, her mouth open, her hair wild. Underneath, 3 words: "She laughed back." And Rome, for all its order, could not erase that sound. They called it the laughter, not hers, but Rome's, because for the first time in living memory, the city had laughed without permission. The sound spread faster than any edict. In the baths, men whispered about the woman who had defied the stage. In markets, sellers mimicked her voice, half afraid, half proud. In temples, priests trembled as pilgrims giggled during prayers. The contagion wasn't noise, it was recognition. Rome had been taught to fear screams. It had never learned what to do with laughter. At first, officials tried to bury it. The governor who had presided over Julia's demonstration was recalled to the capital. His reports were vague. He described a disturbance of mood, a failure of audience decorum. He never wrote the word laughter. To name it would be to confess that control had cracked. But by the end of the week, the rumor had turned holy. Some said Julia's laugh had driven demons from the arena. Others said it was a curse, the voice of the Furies themselves. Rome was good at converting fear into ritual. So the Senate responded the only way it knew how. It legislated emotion. A new decree was carved into marble. Lex Pudicitiae Publicae, the law of public decorum. It forbade disruptive displays of joy during civic ceremonies. The penalty was not death. It was silence. Offenders would spend a day bound before the magistrate's hall, forced to watch in quiet as priests recited verses on humility. They called it reform. It was fear made procedural. Julia watched from a distance as her laughter became law. The irony was exquisite. The empire that had once punished women for defiance now punished them for amusement. Rome had found a way to outlaw delight. Still, the sound persisted. Children imitated it in alleyways. Servants snickered behind curtains. A sculptor in Ostia carved a bust of a woman mid-laugh. The authorities melted it down for blasphemy, but not before it was copied. And in private gatherings, wives began to test the echo. They smiled too long, too openly. They laughed in the wrong moments. Small rebellions, invisible yet contagious. What Rome called indecency was, to them, a form of remembering. In the Senate, philosophers debated the event like a disease. One declared, "The female voice, ungoverned, corrodes reason." Another countered, "No, it reveals truth." The chamber fell silent. Truth was the one word more dangerous than laughter. Julia's name was never mentioned publicly again, but she became the measure by which virtue was policed. Moralists warned their daughters not to smile in public, lest they become another Vtoria. statues of goddesses began to show closed mouths, serene and safe. The empire reshaped even marble to forget her. But marble forgets poorly. On the edge of the city, in an unused storage hall of the old amphitheatre, the original cradle gathered dust. Its wood had darkened, its strap stiff with age. Someone, no one knew who, had carved words into its frame. The letters were uneven, burned by a trembling hand. She laughed. We heard. That night, a guard found the inscription and reported it. By dawn, the cradle had vanished. Some said it was melted into coins. Others claimed it was hidden by servants, buried near the Appian Way. No one ever found it. But the laughter remained. It seeped into songs, into graffiti, into the rhythm of speech itself. Rome tried to drown it in law, but each decree only amplified the echo. The empire discovered what Julia had understood in that final performance. You can choreograph pain, but not its aftermath. And somewhere between those silent households and echoing halls, the meaning of virtue began to rot. For the first time, men hesitated before ordering a punishment. Senators hesitated before cheering a public correction. The question had entered the bloodstream of power, impossible to extract. If virtue required pain, was it still virtue? Rome had no answer. It only had laughter, quiet, persistent, defiant. By the time the next festival came, the amphitheatre remained empty. The officials called it respect. The people called it fear. Julia's voice was gone, but her rhythm had taken hold. The rhythm of refusal disguised as mirth. The empire, that great machine of obedience, had been undone not by revolt, but by amusement. Because laughter, once born from pain, never dies quietly. It began in whispers, as all forbidden stories do. In the port taverns of Ostia, sailors spoke of a woman who had laughed inside the iron frame and walked away untouched. In Antioch, merchants sold tiny charms shaped like open mouths, claiming they warded off fear. By the time the rumor reached Alexandria, she no longer had a name. She was simply the one who laughed. No decree could stop it. Every time the censors erased her story, it multiplied in retelling. Every suppression became a seed. The empire had spent centuries teaching its citizens that silence was safety, but now silence itself had become suspect. To speak of her was rebellion. To remain quiet was complicity. Rome had lost control of the very grammar of obedience. At the height of the panic, a priest in Carthage wrote an anxious letter to his superior. Women smile during penance. They mouth words I do not recognize. The sound is not prayer, it is contagion. He begged for guidance, but there was none. You cannot legislate what people remember. So the empire did what empires always do when faith becomes dangerous. It built new temples. They called them houses of modesty, windowless sanctuaries where women confessed their laughter. Inside, priests recited lessons on virtue, teaching that to smile without permission was to let chaos speak through the body. The rituals grew stranger. Women were made to kneel in silence before polished bronze mirrors until their reflections faded in candlelight. If one smiled, even slightly, she was struck across the face, not to punish, but to remind. They said it was devotion. But the walls heard otherwise. A fragment of a hymn from that period survives, written in a woman's hand on wax tablet. They fear our mouths, not our sins, for a voice is harder to bury than a corpse. By then, Julia's laughter had turned from memory into movement. In the streets, women began to greet each other not with words, but with a faint exhale, a breath shaped like a chuckle, small enough to pass as cough or sigh, a secret language born of endurance. Every empire invents its heresies. Rome's was the idea that women could find freedom in noise. When the governors realized the infection had spread beyond the capital, they sent orders to the provinces. The disciplinaria frames were to be confiscated, melted down, destroyed. Public punishments were suspended for moral reflection. The officials believed that if they erased the instrument, they could erase the memory. But erasure, once begun, turns backward. Without the frame, the empire lost its image of order. Without spectacle, fear lost its stage. The punishments that once united Rome now revealed its fractures. Philosophers began to murmur what could not be spoken aloud, that the same law that silenced wives also bound emperors, that obedience had made the whole city a cradle. Meanwhile, the stories kept mutating. In Gaul, they said the woman's laugh cracked marble. In Egypt, that she became a goddess who smiled upon slaves. In Judea, that her breath carried into the catacombs, where the persecuted whispered it as a blessing before death. The church would later claim that laughter was unholy, that it mocked divine suffering. Yet, even in their scriptures, traces of her rhythm survived. Blessed are those who endure, one line read, for their silence shall become song. It was a safe translation for an unsafe idea. Julia's name returned centuries later, not on monuments, but in margins. Scribes copying philosophical treatises would draw a small curve beneath certain lines, a mark scholars now call the smile of Vtoria. To them, it meant doubt, a way to remember that truth should never be trusted when written by power. By then, Rome was already collapsing under its own weight. Gold had lost its value, legions deserted, temples fell to ruin. But the story endured, because stories don't die when empires do. They hide, waiting for the next civilization that mistakes cruelty for order. And so, across the ruins, across time, across every law that tried to measure obedience, her echo persisted. Not loud, not proud, but steady. The echo of a woman laughing at the machinery of gods and men. No one knew where her body lay. But in every place that empire fell, her laughter returned, light, brief, ungovernable. Because once a single voice has turned pain into music, silence can never be holy again. By the time the laughter reached the Senate, the marble no longer felt cold. Rome had begun to sweat. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation in command, a delay in punishment. A senator rose to condemn the infection of amusement, but stumbled over his own words. Another proposed a law to ban all gatherings of women, only to find his own wife had signed the petition against it. The machinery of law had begun to jam, not through rebellion, but confusion. Because laughter had done what swords could not, it made authority ridiculous. The lex domus, once engraved into every household's threshold, was quietly revised. The phrase, "The wife shall follow the husband's silence," was softened to, "The wife shall preserve harmony." No one dared to explain what harmony meant. In the forum, statues of goddesses with sealed lips began to crumble, not from protest, but neglect. Rome had built itself on spectacle. Without spectacle, it no longer knew what justice looked like. Courts that once staged punishments in daylight now met behind closed doors. Officials whispered verdicts in empty halls. The public, denied its ritual of fear, grew restless. Markets emptied. Priests complained of apathy. People stopped paying to see obedience. They wanted miracles. But miracles require belief, and belief had cracked. A philosopher named Varinus wrote that Rome's sickness was not of flesh, but of faith. He meant it as insult. History reads it as diagnosis. He observed that citizens no longer feared the gods, only the humiliation of being watched. The city had turned inward, a mirror reflecting its own exhaustion. Julia's legend, meanwhile, refused to stay buried. Every time the authorities tried to standardize the story, turning her into either saint or heretic, it slipped through their hands. The people had claimed her as their own, bending her meaning to whatever they needed. To slaves, she was freedom. To mothers, endurance. To philosophers, a warning. To rulers, a ghost. One evening, in the Senate House, a young tribune dared to quote her words aloud. "You can measure silence, but not what it remembers." The hall fell still. The older senators shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the guards. But no order came. How do you punish a sentence that has already outlived you? The session adjourned in silence. Outside, a crowd waited. Someone began to laugh, softly at first, then louder. The guards did nothing. Perhaps they too remembered. That night, the decree arrived from the emperor himself. It was brief. The cradle is to be struck from record, all devices destroyed, all references erased. Let no memory remain. But by then, the law had lost its edge. The scribes obeyed, but their hands betrayed them. Margins filled with small marks, quiet as breath. A curved line, half smile, half scar. The erasure became scripture. Soon after, fires broke out across the lower districts. Temples burned, statues toppled. No uprising was declared, no army assembled. Rome simply stopped believing in its own sanctity. People fled not from invaders, but from the weight of their own silence. When the emperor's palace was looted, the archives were left untouched. The conquerors didn't need to destroy the laws, they had already destroyed themselves. And yet, in the ruins, fragments survived. Tablets scorched, but legible. Records of the disciplinaria, receipts for demonstrations, lists of women's names beside times and payments. Each line a confession of bureaucracy, how suffering was once tallied, taxed, and sanctified. Historians centuries later would call it the collapse of public morality. They would say Rome fell because it lost faith in its gods, because of corruption, invasion, decay. But the truth lay quieter. The empire died the day it could no longer make cruelty look righteous. The law had collapsed not because people rebelled, but because they remembered. Somewhere in the ashes of the Forum, a child found a piece of broken marble. On it, faint but still visible, were two words carved by a tired hand. She spoke. It was enough. Because the end of an empire is not when its armies fall or its temples burn. It's when its silence stops sounding holy. It was not legend that survived. It was evidence. In 1894, a team of Italian archaeologists excavating the ruins of a villa near Ostia uncovered something the records had forgotten to hide. A cellar sealed with ash and lime. Inside were fragments of wood curved like ribs, leather straps hardened to stone, and a bronze nameplate stamped with 2 words, Julia Vtoria. The world had found the cradle. At first, scholars dismissed it as misinterpretation, a religious device or a piece of furniture. But when restorers soaked the wood and revealed faint scratches along its curve, the truth grew louder. The scratches were letters. Crude, uneven, but deliberate. They watched. The curator who handled the object later wrote, "It was as if the timber itself remembered." Other discoveries followed. In the archives of Naples, a physician's notebook described treating wives of senators for displaced shoulders due to moral correction. In the catacombs of Carthage, graffiti repeated a single motif, a woman's open mouth. In the papyrus stores of Alexandria, a half-burned scroll quoted a line once thought apocryphal. She laughed, and the city shivered. Each fragment added a layer to what had once been myth. What had been dismissed as rumor now had material weight. The cradle had not vanished when the empire turned Christian. It had only changed its language. In medieval penitence manuals, a diagram appeared, an arched frame for kneeling to remind the body of humility. Its curvature was identical to the device found in Ostia. Centuries of faith had baptized pain, painting sanctity over its design. The archaeologists argued in journals, each paper more cautious than the last. "We cannot determine intent," one wrote, perhaps symbolic. But the wood spoke otherwise. The joints were worn where wrists had strained. The iron locks bore scratches not of use, but of resistance. The silence of scholarship began to sound like complicity. Museums displayed the fragments under glass. Tourists read the plaques, shook their heads, moved on. "Cruel times," they said, as if cruelty expired with the calendar. Yet standing before the exhibit, you could still sense the architecture of power, how neatly it had fit into reason, how efficiently it had disguised itself as order. Rome had not invented torture, it had invented justification. That was the empire's real masterpiece, making pain look intelligent. In 1937, a historian named Lucia Ferrar wrote an essay that few dared to publish. It began simply. The disciplinaria was not built to punish disobedience. It was built to train witnesses. She argued that the device was never about one woman's submission, but about the crowd's education, teaching Rome how to enjoy hierarchy, how to translate suffering into spectacle. Her paper was suppressed. The archive where she worked burned during the war, but copies survived, carried in secret by students who recognized what she had truly uncovered, that every civilization contains its own cradle, redesigned to fit its conscience. Today, the site at Ostia lies quiet. The villa has no roof, no walls, only outlines of stone glowing under the coastal sun. But in the lower chamber, where the wood once stood, the air still holds a particular stillness, a hush thick as memory. Visitors say they feel watched, though no one remains to see them. Perhaps that is the real haunting of history, not ghosts, but awareness. Each excavation adds more proof and less certainty. The bones do not lie, but they do not explain either. The archaeologist brushing dust from an artifact is no different from the priest reading scripture or the senator writing law. All are deciding what story to tell. And the story of Julia Vtoria, the woman who laughed, continues to resist conclusion. She exists between evidence and imagination, between ruin and ritual. Every fragment excavated pulls her further out of silence, but never into full clarity. She is both myth and record, both warning and witness. When the museum lights go out each night, the glass cases reflect the exit signs. Green, flickering, curved like smiles. Some say it's coincidence. Others say it's reminder. Because somewhere between the archives and the ash, one truth remains constant. History always protects the voice that power tries hardest to erase. The ruins do not forgive, they repeat. And beneath the dust, the ledger is still open. History does not end with victory, it ends with paperwork. In a museum room beneath Rome's Capitoline Hill, there is a glass case labelled simply, Object 407B, Purpose Unknown. Inside it lies what remains of the Disciplinaria Vtoria, 3 fragments of darkened wood, a handful of rusted clasps, and a bronze nameplate half swallowed by corrosion. The tourists who stop to look see only shape, not meaning. They read the placard, take a photograph, and walk away. But the wood remembers. If you look closely, you can still see shallow grooves along the curve, scratches not made by tools, but by hands. They run in opposite directions, desperate, deliberate, overlapping, until they form a pattern almost like writing. Under ultraviolet light, conservators found traces of 2 words carved with a nail. They watched. Purpose unknown. That is how power survives the afterlife, by renaming cruelty as mystery. The museum catalogue describes the object as possibly ceremonial. The description is not entirely wrong. For centuries, that is exactly what it was. Ceremony disguised as justice, ritual disguised as reason, a sacred choreography of obedience. It sits now under sterile glass, stripped of its audience, its victims, its applause. But the silence around it is not peace, it is anesthesia. Rome's cruelty has been neutralized by preservation. The empire that once taught the world how to rationalize pain has succeeded again, this time by turning it into exhibit. Visitors whisper as they pass. Some recoil. Some stare too long. Some smirk, uneasy but fascinated. None notice the irony that their own gaze completes the design. Because the Disciplinaria was never just a device. It was a mirror. It worked only when someone watched. That is the true brilliance of Roman order. Its cruelty depended not on monsters, but on audiences. In one of the curator's notebooks, written decades ago in fading pencil, a note reads, "The cradle is less about punishment than participation. It proves that violence, when properly framed, becomes virtue." The curator never published the observation. The museum prefers neutral labels, not moral verdicts. Neutrality is the new obedience. But the pattern repeats itself with astonishing precision. Rome called its victims disobedient. We call ours unprofessional. Rome rewarded silence as virtue. We reward it as stability. Different words, same geometry. Every civilization builds its own cradle, shaped not of wood, but of policy, etiquette, and fear. Each time someone is told to quiet down for the sake of harmony, a new strap tightens. Each time pain is reclassified as order, the device hums back to life. We think the past is gone because its instruments have decayed. But the machinery of obedience never dies. It only updates its design. The Disciplinaria. Vtoria taught Rome how to believe in its own innocence. Ours teaches us the same. Archaeologists still argue whether Julia Vtoria ever truly lived. Some call her an invention, a composite myth. A scholar once said, "She exists only because we need her too." Perhaps that's true, but even if her body never existed, her silence did. Every woman bent by law, every witness trained to look away, every system built to sanctify control, those were real. She is the name history gives to what can't be counted, but refuses to vanish. The past isn't something we study, it's something we rehearse. Each time we justify cruelty in the name of order, we speak fluent Latin. Each time we pretend not to see, we echo the Senate. Each time we call suffering a lesson, we rebuild the cradle plank by plank. And somewhere, quietly, someone is still laughing. When the lights in the museum go out at night, the motion sensors fall silent. The room breathes. The air grows heavy, as if waiting. The guard swears he once heard a sound, wood creaking, faint but rhythmic, like someone shifting against invisible bindings. He tells no one. He has learned that silence keeps you employed. In the morning, school groups pass through, taking notes for essays about Roman culture. The guide points to the exhibit and says, "This is what happens when power goes too far." But power never believes it has gone far enough. That is why the ledger never truly closes. Each empire believes it has learned the lesson. Each writes new laws, new ethics, new versions of mercy. But beneath the new vocabulary, the old logic waits, unchanged, unrepentant, immortal. History is not a circle. It is a spiral, descending quietly toward the same conclusion. Control always finds another name. Stand in front of the glass long enough, and the reflection merges with the object. You see yourself framed by it. The wood behind you, the straps in line with your shoulders. You realize, for a breath, that you have become both witness and subject. That the story of Rome is not about the past at all. It is a diagram of the present. Every empire ends the same way, not with rebellion, but with recognition. When the audience finally sees itself on the stage, the performance collapses. Perhaps that is why Julia laughed. It was not madness, it was revelation. The sound of someone realizing that the machinery could only run as long as people believed it was holy. Her laughter was not against pain, it was against meaning. Against the idea that obedience could ever be beautiful. That sound has traveled farther than Rome's armies, farther than its laws, farther than its marble. It reaches us even now, faint but certain, under the hum of every institution that calls itself civilized. Because civilization, at its most dangerous, is just cruelty with good manners. So the ledger closes, the lights dim, the tourists leave, but the object remains, still whispering its unfinished sentence. If you listen closely, you can almost hear her voice, the laughter beneath the wood, the echo beneath the glass, the question that refuses to die. How many systems of virtue are built on the sound of women holding their breath? The museum will not answer. The historians will not. The laws will not. But the ruins will. They always do. If you value the record, remember this: empires fall, ledgers close, but the bones still speak.